opinions expressed are the speaker's own and does not represent legal or accounting advice or counsel and should not be seen as such. The material and information presented here is for general information purposes only, a conversation. We make no promises or assertions on how this information will impact your business, your personal life, or financial well-being. The information relayed does not imply endorsement or offer opposition to any specific organization, product, or services. My name is Lori Power, and I'm your host. Let's have a conversation. Without question, family businesses are highly complex, demanding an exceptional level of fluency in family enterprise advising. In the next decade, it is said that tens of thousands of families will transfer or try to transfer to the next generation or even the third generation. That's about 60% of family-owned businesses. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Leah Tolton, corporate lawyer with Bennett Jones. Leah practices corporate law with a particular focus on providing legal services to ultra high net worth families and their companies, family-owned businesses, and their owners and boards of directors in matters related to corporate governance and succession planning, corporate structuring, and sophisticated corporate reorganizations. She has extensive experience in the strategic planning, succession planning, risk management, mergers, acquisitions, and sales transactions of family-owned businesses. Leah, can you tell me a little bit about your practice and how you maybe perhaps got into law and then what made you transition to working more with family enterprises versus, the more broader corporate structures?
Well, thanks, Lori. The story of how I got into law is actually a long story, so I'll give you the Coles Notes version of that. I came out of my first degree with a degree in human ecology and a family studies major. And so I envisioned that I was going to be a helping professional of some sort. A number of the roles that I had in my early career involved acting as an employment counselor to vulnerable populations, people who either had multiple handicaps or they received social allowance. And in that capacity, I had the opportunity to avail myself of some career testing tools so that I knew how they worked and I could assist people to find employment that would suit their goals. And the results for me that came out of that indicated I should either be working in business or in law. So as a result, I wrote the LSAT, I was admitted to law school, I finished that, and here I am as a corporate lawyer, and I've been a corporate lawyer now for over 30 years.
That is a fabulous beginning and certainly does bookend to working with family enterprise. At what point did you decide to, or were you able to specialize your practice almost from the beginning based on your past experience?
Well, I don't know that I would say that my specialty came about from the beginning of my practice, but I would say that I practiced as a corporate lawyer in Edmonton, Alberta, since I graduated from law school at the U of A. And as a result of that, I worked with many corporate clients who had various transition and growth needs, whether they be acquiring capital, whether they be acquiring other businesses or expanding into new premises or new jurisdictions. Whether they were acquiring employees, whether they were selling the whole thing. And the enterprises that were in those growth and transition phases, because they're based in Edmonton, were often focused on a trade. Often they were focused on and made their fortune in the context of oil extraction or building significant capital projects, for example, up at Fort McMurray. And because they started as tradespeople, very often those businesses were family owned by definition. So I didn't really choose to specialize in family owned businesses. It just came about as a result of the type of corporate clients I had and the market in which I work.
I can relate to that because when I started in employee group benefits back in the day, it was through a consultant that was Toronto based. And they talked about these larger corporations, but we didn't have that here in Edmonton.
Exactly.
We had small family-run organizations that were typically around 15 employees, but mom and pop whether that's politically
Mhm.
correct anymore or not, I'm not sure, but mom and pop ran the shop. They
Yeah.
they ran the organization and then treated their employees much like an extended family.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I can relate to that a lot. One of the things I admire when I'm working with professionals such as yourselves are people that will go and take the designation to really help move their profession forward.
Mhm.
We meet a lot of people who perhaps dabble or actually work in this space, but don't
Mhm.
have the credentials or the expertise. They haven't taken that extra initiative to train themselves in that speciality.
Mhm.
What first prompted you to go for your family enterprise? Because that's a big endeavor and
Mhm.
it's a commitment to add to your practice. What prompted you to move forward there? I can guess that you are a lifelong learner, but
Mm.
I'd rather hear what prompted you to do that.
Well, two things. I can give you two answers in response to that. First of all, it became apparent to me at a certain point in my practice, when I'd reached a fairly senior level, that the commonality among my clients was that they were primarily all family owned. And so I saw that there would be value to those clients in obtaining that additional education and designation to assist them through the things I was starting to see now that I was the senior person taking the calls. I also benefited greatly earlier in my practice from the mentorship of a senior lawyer who employed processes that are very similar to what are propounded in the Family Enterprise Advisor designation. So it was his practice to collect a group of professionals who worked regularly with the same type of clients and perhaps even with the same clients, and so we would see these folks on files all the time. He would convene regular meetings with the professionals in attendance. We would all consult about where the family was at, what the family was looking to achieve between meetings. We would all discuss what our respective roles were to bring that about. We would leave with a work plan that set out who had what responsibility to complete before we met again. And so we were all used to working together to accommodate the family's wishes and goals and the things that were changing in the family. We all knew what everyone's wheelhouse was and how information we had affected what someone else had to do. So we all shared information that was appropriate. We were all accountable to each other. We had to come back and say, okay, we've got to this point and now we need to take this next step, or I need you to have this input. And I just observed that as a really effective way to coordinate and provide really solid complementary advice to families.
And it puts them first, doesn't it?
Totally. Yeah.
There's something to be said about that common language,
Mm-hmm.
speaking around the table, working for the betterment of the family. When you go
Mm-hmm.
into family enterprise, say it's a new client to you, I like looking at trends. I like looking at,
Mm-hmm.
where do we start with this family? And there's usually a good starting point. Do you have a common starting point when you first start working with a family enterprise?
Well, I'll give you a sense of what I view as a family enterprise before I respond to that question, because I think a lot of people think about it in terms of the actual company that operates the family business, whatever that is. But a family enterprise can include perhaps a company that owns real estate. It can include a company that holds assets or investments that are not related to the family business that makes the money that feeds them all every day. It can maybe include some deferred assets that we're going to receive later. It can include some heirloom assets, things we're going to get from somewhere else, things like family cottages or things like that. Can include philanthropic assets, charitable endeavors that people want to undertake, and includes all the people in the system, right? So all the kids, all the in-laws, all the grandkids, blended families, all that stuff. So all those people also factor into that enterprise. So, to answer your question about the trends and where I would start, you can understand when I give you that big picture that there can be a lot going on. And the point of entry could differ depending on how the question comes to me. So, at heart, I'm a corporate lawyer. So I do things that help companies get bigger or grow or transition or, create relationships among the owners that will govern how they relate to each other while they're owners. But maybe somebody is looking to buy a commercial real estate project or invest in a commercial real estate project that's going to diversify the company's wealth. Maybe someone has reached the point where they want to reward people who contributed to their success, and they want to introduce employees to the ownership group. Maybe that's how it comes about. Maybe they've reached the point where they've got sufficient resources and they want to give back to the community that made them successful. So maybe it's philanthropy that's the point of entry. Very often the core concepts around which things I would get involved would coalesce would be around tax. Often tax is a point of entry. The corporate issues I've already described, and maybe wills and estate planning. I don't do wills and estates myself, but I rely on my colleagues to support me with that. So that's the most likely questions that will arise as they apply to any one of those things in the enterprise as a whole.
I appreciate that clarification because you're right. You get doglocked sometimes on thinking of a family enterprise, exactly what I had explained at the first.
Mm-hmm.
The spouses running the organization, or
Yeah.
maybe two siblings running an organization,
Yeah.
maybe a parent and a child running an organization, and then the employees. So I really appreciate the clarity of, no, this is significantly more. So we haven't
Mm-hmm.
narrowed the focus, we've widened the
Exactly.
focus.
Yeah. And
That's
actually when people start looking at that from the perspective of enterprise, sometimes they look at it and realize that the operating company is the smallest part of their wealth. Yeah.
and
And
it can
so
be very overwhelming. It must
mm-hmm.
be when they get to the time that they're pulling in experts like yourself,
Mm-hmm.
because we all know we don't pull them in at the right time.
Of course not. Right. We wouldn't have jobs if they did.
I know, I know. So when they're pulling in experts like yourself at that point, it must be a little bit overwhelming to see what they have amassed and where they are now.
It can be, there are still times that I look at the picture that's presented to me and I think, wow, this one, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on, or there's a lot of value here, or man, there's a lot of work to be done. So yeah, certainly once they get to a certain stage and they've accumulated all those things or they've worked on all those things over time, yeah, it can be very significant.
Thank you so much for sending me through one of the reports that you had, ready, willing, and interested
Yeah,
report.
yeah.
One of the graphics, if we take it to a family enterprise that is a corporation, take it within that
Mm-hmm.
corporation point
Mm-hmm.
of view, what really struck me is concerns about intergenerational transfer. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
top concerns was
Yeah.
the next generation isn't ready. Now,
Mm-hmm.
that to me is like a parent to child, you're not old enough to do this,
Oh yeah.
and so I would think that it's more the generation that would be leaving is considering, because so much of what they do is likely locked into their identity of who
Mm-hmm.
they are and who they see themselves being.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is it hard to transition it off, but it's much easier, a bit of a scapegoat, if you would, to say, well, you're not ready anyway, or you can't do it
Mm-hmm.
because.
Mm-hmm.
That must be a significant hurdle to overcome when you start working with the family.
It's actually one of the biggest hurdles that family enterprises encounter is the lack of preparation of the next generation. And so many families encounter that in some form. Sometimes it's, as you say, mom and dad say you're just not ready. Sometimes it's the kids who say I'm not ready. It can take a lot of different forms, but that's absolutely a top issue that family enterprises face. And so, the way that family enterprises successfully deal with that, the ones who navigate it successfully, uh, they have regular conversations and discussions about what ready looks like, right? So that involves the people who are running the show now. It involves the people who might succeed. It might involve their spouses, right? It might involve a lot of people, like existing employees who are maybe senior executives who would have to work with the family members, but it involves input from those folks to define what is ready. And after there's some consensus or some understanding around what is ready, then successful enterprises also apply some thought to what does it take to get someone ready. And when they apply thought to what you need to do to get there, then you start talking about education plans. You start talking about work experience. Is that in the business? Is that with someone else? Is that do you have to go and work somewhere else for a certain period of time or at a certain subsidiary or in a certain country or whatever in order to get ready? Do you need to attend a certain number of meetings with key customers or connections so you develop relationships? Is that what's ready? So people or enterprises more successfully navigate that transition to get people ready if they've applied some thought to what it means to them and what they have to do to get people there.
I have come across in working with clients, and it strikes me as very interesting the dynamic of somebody who perhaps took over from a parent
Mm-hmm.
is reaching an age where you would think they would start thinking about that next generation coming in.
Mm-hmm.
But we see from the outside, it's awfully easy to look at things from the outside and not from the in.
Mm-hmm.
So from the
Mm-hmm.
outside perspective, it looks very much like they're doing almost the same things that they didn't appreciate when they were succeeding into the
Mm-hmm.
role. Do you
Mm-hmm.
see those kinds of cyclical behaviors often? And again, we're going to narrow our discussion down to that corporate entity, that family ran.
I don't know if I would describe it as cyclical necessarily within the family system, but you do see common themes that arise often. And you touched on one yourself in one of your earlier comments, and that is, identity, right? So a recurring theme that you see is that the founders have a lot of their identity wrapped up in having created this business, what it takes to make this business successful, what it takes to run it and have it, carry on, to support many people into the future. And so there's a component here, not only of successors being ready, but of founders being ready, right? And so that is a recurring theme. And I see that theme arising whether there's been some tough love applied for the founder or not. Like it really is about how much emotional attachment I have, what I need to work through in order to be ready myself to transition. That occurs regularly.
And some of the founders are so dynamic. I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they've gone through thick and thin in this province in particular
Absolutely.
to make it successful for that next generation to come in. And I have met many a founder who have said, well, I've succeeded it to so and so, and the next generation is effectively running the business, but
Yep.
this dynamic personality is still
Yep.
floating around the edges,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a bit of
Mm-hmm.
havoc that happens
Yeah.
with it because nobody wants to, as you said, apply the tough love. The tough love was actually getting them to sign the paper
Yep.
over, but
Yep.
now they're hovering as part of this, and in some ways it's they still have so much to offer, but
Yep.
they're not in the role to offer it.
Yeah. And so, that ties in with a concept that you mentioned in materials I shared with you, and the concept of being ready, willing, and able, right? Are you ready, willing, and able to share value? And are you ready, willing, and able to share control? And, the people who hover and who are parachuting in, not yet ready, willing, and able to share control, not ready to let go of that yet. And so, again, I go back to how successful family businesses navigate this. And very, very often it's through communication that might include some difficult conversations, right? About, okay, what's your expectation? How do we make this work? What do we need to do to get there? And, hopefully then both the successor and the founder are reaching a point where they're ready, willing, and able to do both.
Since joining into this space a couple of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I will profess my ignorance to, I had an interest in it, but I had no idea the breadth
Mm-hmm.
and the
Mm-hmm.
scope of the work. And now it seems everybody I know is in some form involved in succession planning, and you realize
Mm-hmm.
that we've all been involved in succession planning from the moment we came into business.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
it brings those items to light. I find the conversations are becoming easier to have with people as they awaken perhaps to needing it as part of the strategic plan. Where do you see succession planning going over the next few years?
Well, I would answer that by saying that I think, what you're describing is an evolution in the way that people view succession planning. Like typically when people think about succession planning in the context of a lawyer and what a lawyer does, they think about their will, their enduring power of attorney, their personal directive, and they're done, right? No. What There's a whole lot of planning and thinking to be done long before those documents, which come into effect when you're dead, right? Like you're still alive, you're still running a business, or a business is running with some contribution from you and family members, and maybe you're transitioning that to family members. And to my mind, that's where people are starting to understand that there is a significant component of succession to be considered and planned for before you get to the state that you need the documents that apply when you're administering an estate. So how are we going to prepare people to be employees? How are we going to prepare them to be leaders? How are we going to prepare them to be owners? All those things are components of succession planning that falls squarely within my corporate lawyer wheelhouse, and that should relate to your estate planning documents, but really impact you right here, right now.
Clarity is kindness and
Mm-hmm.
chaos is unkind, to
Uh-huh.
break it down that way. When I'm talking to people, I will say the more clarity you can put into what you want to have happen.
Exactly.
I challenge owners sometimes, and this again, I work with the employees in this
Mm-hmm.
space, not the owners, particularly on succession planning. I like planting the bug, but then
Yeah.
somebody else will come in and work specifically with the owners. I like working with the employees to transition
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the bugs I like to put in the ears of employers is, think about if you had a choice today on who you would want to sell your business to.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a competitor that you admire, if
Mm-hmm.
you have a family member that you think is capable, if you
Mm-hmm.
have somebody in mind, write it down. And to
Mm-hmm.
me, that is a kindness that you can give somebody, that if you've done nothing else in that succession planning, which of course we want them to do all of the succession planning,
Of
but
course.
if you've done nothing else, if you write that down, at least it gives the person who has to deal with that paperwork, with those tax
Mm-hmm.
implications,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
an insight into where you would want that business to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, to your point of clarity is kindness, information and communication is key. And ideally we'd like to know that information before the crisis hits, and we need to open those documents and see what they say. And to your point about if you'd like a family member to take over, from my perspective, looking at this from the state of the world before you get there, it would be helpful to know if the people in your plan can live with your plan,
Oh, yeah,
right?
truly. Yes.
Like if you're picking a family member, have you talked to them? Do they know? Are they interested? Are they ready? Is this something they want for their life and for their family? Helpful to have that information before any paper is prepared of any kind that says this family member is the one who's going to take over. Like that's a big leap for someone to take without knowing that A, they're the plan, and B, they can live with it.
Well, and it's much like if I was thinking about my own children when
Mm-hmm.
they were teenagers, and I would say, okay, well, it's easy. I'm just going to succeed my business to them without ever having their input or asking them. But now it's 10 years later, they're in lives
Yeah.
of their own, they're in careers of their own that are distinctly different than mine.
Yeah.
Now what's happened to my plans if that was the case?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And, depending on how long the window is between the time that you're running your business and the time you need those estate planning documents we're talking about, a long period of time could go by. And while you may have a piece of paper somewhere that says, I'd like this family member to take over, if that's 30 years from now, and it could be, let's hope it is, right?
Yeah.
That's what we all hope, that we'll never look at those things for decades. But if it's 30 years from now, by that time, that person who's now 25 or 30 is now 60,
Yeah.
right? And has built their own business or has built their own life and has children who are now 40 and has grandchildren that are now 20. Like, is that really what you want to have happen here? Like, time marches on. And just like I say about people revisiting their estate plans every few years, because things change in your life and in the people's lives who are affected by it, you need to be doing the same thing in your business.
Yeah.
Right? You need to be saying, okay, so who have I got at the table now, and who's performing what role? And are those the roles I still need, or do I need more roles? And if I need more roles, who fills those roles? And are they family members or not? This is an
Who are they
iterative
married
process.
to?
Who are
Who
they
are they
married to?
married to? Is there a prenup in place? Do I
Absolutely.
want that family member
Absolutely
perhaps
right.
coming in where I didn't expect them to come in?
Exactly.
Can
Exactly.
you, if it's possible, can you share on broader terms a success story of family you went in to start working with, the kind of work that you did, and the transition that happened at the end, if that's at all possible, without giving away all the ghosts in the closet?
The ghosts have to stay in the closet. But, I would say generally that, you know, I see success when people start before there's a crisis, right? And they're thinking about this in a deliberate way as opposed to reacting. I see success where people have given thought to who are the players at any given time, and they've talked to them. And so they've heard from the daughter in law what the daughter in law would think if her spouse was called upon to step into a leadership role on an unexpected basis. What would that do in that household? They've had conversations like that. They've taken that into account. They've consulted with people about how they could see this unfolding, got their feedback on that. If they've taken the time to think, to ask, to plan, then I see success. So it doesn't really matter what sector you're in, but if you're approaching this from a thoughtful place as opposed to a reactive place, things always tend to go better. And if you consult with people and give them a voice in a process, they will trust the process. They will want to stick around, right? They'll become more engaged in that. So those are the kinds of things I see people do that lead to success.
It always comes down to structure and process.
And communication. And
Yes.
communication, really.
What are some of the warnings that we could share if people are just waiting for the crisis to happen? What are some of the, because it could go from bad to worse very quickly.
Okay, so the things that tend to go off the rails tend to arise because there's unresolved conflict or there are unspoken things that have taken place. So, and the conflict often arises because there's a perception that someone received favor. Dad always loved you best. You never had to work as hard as the rest of us. You had everything handed to you, blah, blah. So any perception of favor that exists is not going to get better when the crisis hits. Also, if there are gaps in information that people have, for various reasons, they don't have to be nefarious, but, if mom and dad have been operating a business and the kids don't know the story, parent and kid, or, parent and some kids, but not all kids are operating a business and not everyone knows what's going on or what the plan is. People do what people do. People will jump to conclusions, make assumptions, assume the worst. That's what they do when they have gaps to fill. They don't go to a good place, they go to a bad place. So, when the crisis hits, all of that gets amplified. And so people now assume you're in a position of control or you have influence, you've got all the money, you're going to self-deal, you're going to, cut us all out, whatever you're going to do. This is why communication in advance helps that, because people don't fill in the gaps. They have the information for the gaps. And then the fight is not on. That's the goal.
And I think you and I have both seen situations where if that's happened, it has broken otherwise
Absolutely.
fairly tight families.
Absolutely.
And that's a tragedy.
Absolutely. And when the family is on shaky ground to begin with, it's very difficult to pull the relationships back if those natural tendencies that people want to engage in or are inclined to engage in. If they do, it's very hard to pull them back after that.
Yeah. We have to remember too that siblings by and large are naturally competitive with one another
Mm-hmm.
in ways that
Mm-hmm.
are unspoken to anybody
Correct.
not within that family unit. So I'm assuming that when you're working with a family and you're putting clarity into those processes, who's ready, how are they ready, can
Mm-hmm.
we move forward, and everybody understands, it diffuses that natural cynicism, that natural competitiveness,
Yep.
that you're receiving favor over somebody else.
Absolutely. And, ideally it creates, a situation that we describe as family cohesion, which is different from family harmony. Okay. So let's just be clear. We don't always have to like each other, even in this process. We may never, right? We may never get to that place. And it doesn't always have to involve forgiveness, right? We don't have to get over it. But if we feel like we have had an opportunity to say how this affects me, and that's been taken into account, and we trust that there is a fair process, that we're going to be heard and our input will be considered, we're more likely to be cohesive. Okay, I'm going to stick with this system because at least I have a say of some sort and people will hear me. That's totally different than I've been excluded, you've been favored, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, yeah, and you can work within that system.
Mm-hmm.
What keeps you working in this area of practice of law? What keeps you motivated to come back and keep doing it?
You know, while the themes are the same, they always appear in a slightly different way. There's such variety in the way that people relate to each other and have put things together and have been successful or not. There's such a variety of situations people have find themselves in and want to get themselves out of. So it's just fascinating to see what people built, and so there's always some new way to approach it and think, okay, well, this looks like the priority here. Let's see if we pull that thread, if that will work. So the variety and the challenge, I think, keep me at it.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom with me. I have a lot to learn. And you know what? Just simply going through the aspect of family enterprise and broadening the scope
Mm-hmm.
of what I had initially envisioned is, if I only have one nugget to take away, you've given me at least that one nugget, but you've given me so much more. So I appreciate the insight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure talking to you.